Tonight, we're going to be speaking about the Korean Peninsula and the situation there. There's been a lot of developments recently, a new North Korean missile test, new elections, new incoming president in South Korea. And our guest, John Delury, is professor of Chinese studies at Yonsei University's Graduate School of International Studies and Underwood International College in Seoul, South Korea. He's the author of several books, including the new book, Agents of Subversion, The Fate of John T. Downey and the CIA's Covert War in China. And he's also co-authoring a book on the political history of North Korea and the keys to the longevity and resilience of Kim family rule. His PhD is from Yale. Welcome, Dr. Delury.
Thanks a lot, John. I'm looking forward to this. Thanks for inviting me.
Absolutely, absolutely. And for those of you listening in, you can drop questions into the Q&A feature, and I'll make sure to ask them. Feel free to upvote others' questions that you'd like to hear asked as well. But one of the things that's been getting a lot of attention here in Washington is that there's been a lot of talk recently in South Korea about the prospect of pursuing a nuclear arsenal. What's going on here, and is this a good idea? How's it going to affect the relationship with the United States, the situation in the region?
Great. Well, we'll dive right into that one, and I would probably break that question into two parts. One is, how do we assess, kind of how serious this thing is about South Korea wanting nukes of its own, and what does nukes of its own mean is a sub question. And then the second part is, do I think it's a good idea? Is it a good idea? Ramifications. So in terms of, honestly, John, I struggle with this one a lot in terms of like, how serious is this? I mean, I've been here since 2010, living and teaching in Seoul. And I've seen these cycles of, South Korea, new poll. It's always a new poll tells us, it seems like the polls always say 70% of Koreans want their own nukes. And, I'm smiling because I'm pretty cynical about a lot of that polling, to be honest, even when it's done by very reputable people, because it's so, as we know, all polls are very sensitive to how you ask the question. But this one in particular is really sensitive. You can easily and even innocently frame it as, well, wouldn't it be great if South Korea had nuclear weapons? And you get 7 out of 10 people would be like, fine. Whereas if you go through the second part of your question, what does the ramifications mean? Economically, in terms of international status, legal status, all of these things, then I think the answers really do start to change. So it's just what I'm getting at is, in my lived experience here, put it this way, no South Korean has ever brought up to me in a conversation, or if I heard them bring it up with others, darn it, if we just had nuclear weapons, we wouldn't have this problem. So I'm skeptical that there's really this groundswell of kind of demand. And in the absence of that, I see it more as sort of a top-down thing, where there are those who think it would be a good idea, and they're kind of pushing an agenda. So now that gets to the second part is that a good agenda or not? Would it be good for South Korea? Would it be good for the region? Would it be good for the alliance with the United States if South Korea had nukes of its own? And again, nukes of its own could mean some nuclear sharing arrangement where U.S. nukes are brought back, and there's some kind, and there are different permutations of this, where South Korea gets some kind of say in their use or not. Two, that would be at one end of the spectrum. Two, they've got their own nuclear program. They build their own nuclear weapons. They deploy them. They have sole discretion over how they're used. And so there's a big, big spectrum there, obviously. In my view, though I'm open to this debate, I'm not doctrinaire about it, but I don't really see how this helps. It's such a bad situation already. We've been stuck in a quagmire of dealing with North Korea on many levels, including the nuclear issue, which has obviously not gotten better for decades. I see this as an idea that just adds one more element of instability. I don't buy the arguments that if South Korea has its own nukes, somehow you get to denuclearization. That argument's out there, but I do not find that persuasive. And I guess at the end of the day, I don't see the status quo as so dangerous. I don't think North Korea is about to use its nuclear weapons. I don't see any prospect of them giving them up, but I also don't think they're about to use them unless someone goes first. And meanwhile, I actually see the U.S. deterrent against North Korea as quite solid in the sense that you tell me, you guys on this call, in my experience in the US, Americans wouldn't bat an eye about using nukes against North Korea in a kind of wartime scenario where, people were dying and this sort of thing. And the defense of the United States were at stake, would not bat an eye. Whereas South Koreans would bat an eye because it's right there. You have divided families. You have still a sense of it's one place. It should be reunified ultimately. And so the whole psychology around deterrence is so different if you're South Korea with your own nukes, thinking about, are we really going to do this? Whereas there's something very cold about the United States, which has threatened many times throughout its history, if you know the history, to actually use nuclear weapons against North Korea. And I've looked at the documents, really actually was very close to doing it, or seriously deliberating on doing it because there's absolutely no feeling there. It is so cold. And in a strange way, that creates a credibility to the deterrence, which actually would not transfer over to South Korea. And in that sense, I think it would make it less credible and therefore more dangerous. And so I'm not a fan of that idea.
And we've got a follow-up question here from our audience from Christopher Inclon, who asks, has China's nuclear arsenal and its buildup of nuclear weapons recently factored into this question and to South Korea's foreign policy more broadly? Is this something that's on their minds a lot?
I'm not sure that China, yes. And the general picture of China's rise, if that's even the right way to put it anymore, China's kind of risen and inexorably continuing to rise. That factors constantly. That I would say is at the center of the, sort of grand strategy debate here in South Korea. Sometimes you can't read it as much or hear it as much because it's more sensitive than North Korea, which you can openly talk about in a way more easily because there's a little bit less at stake, strangely. Whereas, with China, it's obviously so complicated where you have a quarter of the South Korean economy is in one shape or another dependent on that economic linkage with China, and you have the geographical proximity. So my general answer to that is yes, and we can look into different aspects of that. On the nuclear issue, I would say less so, and this gets at something very important, a difference I see as someone who studies US-China relations, but then is here and at least aware of kind of South Korea-China relations. You have to recognize the asymmetry. South Korea doesn't see itself as even on the same plane as China, whereas the United States and China do now see one another on the same general plane. And therefore, those kinds of changes of like how much better China's nuclear capabilities get, that has a much stronger impact on the US, which is concerned about parity and supremacy, hegemony, and various kinds of things. Whereas for South Korea, it's like, well, you're not even playing on that court. Like, so as China makes these incremental increases in advantages, I think in that sphere, they have less impact probably on the South Korean perception and debate than in the United States.
Well, speaking of nuclear issues, several weeks ago, North Korea had a ballistic missile test that got a lot of attention here in the United States, and there's been a lot of controversy about it as well. What was the deal with this test? What do you think they were trying to do?
It's a good question. There'll probably be more. Everyone's ready. Actually, it's April 13th for you guys. It's the morning of the 14th here. Tomorrow, April 15th, is a big day in North Korea. It's the anniversary of the birth of Kim Il-sung, the founder. And it's actually, he was born in 1912. So it's a 10-year, it's an even anniversary. So they sort of should do something big. So there's all kinds of speculation. And the U.S., for those who follow this, is parked one of the, which is it? The USS Abraham Lincoln is parked somewhere offshore getting ready for whatever they do. So it's not only did that last test, which was part of kind of a series of tests that got a good bit of attention. That was March 24th here, I think. But then there have been a series from late February, early March, and then that one. It could be back in the news, in 48 hours. So what are they up to? I mean, there's different theories of it. And honestly, I don't know exactly which hypothesis is correct. There are some equally plausible interpretations of what's going on. One school of thought is that they are basically just keeping they call it their treasured sword of deterrence. They're keeping the sword sharp. They are continuing to improve and expand their capabilities. Like, if you pay attention, everyone is doing. If you pay attention, as we were just talking about China, a lot of improvement, Russia, a whole other question. But apart from Ukraine, steady improvement in its nuclear capabilities and strategic capabilities. The US obviously is doing it all the time, although we don't always have newspaper articles about it. And South Korea, tons of developments. So in a certain sense, North Korea is both contributing to that, but also just keeping up with everyone else and maintaining its kind of advantages and showing everyone that it's making progress. The last couple of tests were not very successful. And so because of that, there may be even more pressure on Kim Jong-un and his rocketeers to change the narrative, because there's a little bit of a narrative of like, meh. Whereas in 2017, it was like, whoa, what are the North Koreans doing? So I go to that hypothesis first, probably because I do see that as the most persuasive. But secondary explanations are that related. These, you don't have to choose between these. It's maybe primarily for domestic purposes rather than for international purposes. So there's not a lot going on really that's good in North Korea. And like any regime, they need to tell a story. Kim Jong-un is a very public figure. He travels the country a lot. He's in the news, obviously, all the time. And he needs stuff. He needs both theater and real, quote unquote, accomplishments to point to associate himself with, to keep up a good narrative, to legitimate himself. It's not a simple story of totalitarian repression. There are very active efforts by the propaganda machine to tell, positive stories to keep the patriotism up and all that. And really, the one thing he's got is the weapons, the satellite. We're anticipating a satellite launch. There could be another nuclear test. There could be a submarine-based test. So these are dramatic things. They work well for TV and for news. And so I do think that would be another rationale, is for, maintaining a domestic narrative that keeps Kim Jong-un looking good. He kind of needs a win. Economy's not going great. There's not been the big breakthrough diplomacy that we saw in 2018. And so this is one place to kind of drum up a narrative. So there are others, but I guess I'll stop there. Those would be probably my two first. That's where I'd go first in order to explain, kind of what may be behind these tests and the intention behind them.
Well, sticking with politics, South Korea is getting a new president in about a month. What can you tell us about the new incoming president, Yoon Suk-yeol?
Well, I've not met President-elect Yoon, so I can't say anything from firsthand experience or basis. And actually, one thing I noted during the campaign is a lot of my South Korean friends and colleagues who at the end of the day, it's a fairly small country. It's a small elite. I would have expected more of them to know Yoon. But that I think is actually significant in that he wasn't the heir apparent, or kind of the obvious pick, the Hillary or the Jeb or whatever you want to say. He came a little bit, not totally out of left field, but he doesn't come out of this pedigree as it's the conservative party. They call themselves the People Power Party now. He didn't come out of this long history as a party insider, or he has no political experience. He's not held elective office. He's a prosecutor. His background is in law and prosecution, and he's been involved in some very high profile political, how should I say, prosecutions of political figures, including the impeached president, former President Park Geun-hye. So he comes out of that sort of background and world, and he was a bit of a dark horse candidate, you could say, in that sense. And it also means, like, as you ask me more questions, I'm going to say it's hard to know. I don't really know. And that's because a lot of the people I know who I would trust to know, say from the conservative side, they don't sound 100% sure. They haven't been 100% sure because A lot of this, he may not know. He doesn't know how he's going to act. He hasn't made these kinds of decisions before. He's not made foreign policy decisions or domestic policy decisions in that sense. And so it's much harder to assess. The assessments are based on, who he's surrounded himself by, what the party that he's not running as kind of a Macron style, create his own party. He did run within the main conservative party. So you can sort of infer based on party preferences. And now you can infer based on the appointments, like just yesterday and a week ago, he has made his first major cabinet selections and appointments. And so you can make certain inferences from the people that he's choosing, the direction. But the first thing I'd say is to emphasize a little bit of the question marks, known, unknown, that no one can know because he hasn't made these kinds of decisions before. So that's probably what I would say by preface in terms of President-elect Yoon.
One thing that made a lot of headlines here is that he spoke of something to the effect of bringing U.S. nuclear weapons back to the peninsula, some desire for a greater role for U.S. nuclear weapons in South Korea's deterrence. What can you tell us about that? Is this something that looks likely? How serious is it? Or is it another one of these? Let's wait and see.
It's a wait and see. Actually, I'd have to check the exact quote. There were a number of these issues. Another one that we might want to talk about that I would say is probably more on the near-term shopping list than bringing nukes back is additional deployments of the THAAD battery. If you guys are familiar with THAAD, Terminal High Altitude Area Defense, which is a missile defense system, a U.S. missile defense system that was brought in with a lot of controversy, especially from China in 2016. And then China, basically hit back with some pretty intense economic sort of sanctions, for lack of a better word, on South Korea. And that one battery still is here, that battery, but there's also been discussion of adding more. I would put, in kind of the menu of where we could see change, I would say additional THAAD deployment would be well ahead of nuclear deployments. I think things would have to get really hairy. Now, actually, I do expect them to get pretty bad, but things would have to get a lot worse in terms of the standoff with North Korea before. So, that's not like the kind of thing that I say would happen this year. You can invite me back and I'll laugh at me when it does. But to me, that's a little bit more, I wouldn't call it a dog whistle, but it's kind of a way to signal, strength and in the campaign mode, and kind of like, this outgoing administration has been too weak. We're going to be stronger. We're not going to put up with stuff. We're going to be tougher. Talk about maybe we need nukes back on the peninsula. The last thing I'd say, John, and to those who asked, is a lot, this ultimately is a question for the alliance. This is not really something where South Korea can just decide by any stretch of the imagination. Like, if they want to do it, the United States has to be basically 110% behind what they want to do. And so I might throw that back at you guys. You can tell me, does the United States really want South Korea? First of all, again, on that spectrum, what does the United States want? Because that's 51% of the answer to the question.
Yeah, well, and sticking to that THAAD issue for a second, it was part of a number of things I noticed when I was looking at a translation of the new president's foreign policy document. It talks about THAAD, which is something China isn't going to like. Talks about, kind of cooperating more with the Quad, eventually becoming a member, another thing China probably isn't going to like. Mm-hmm. And overall, the tone on China compared to all the other places he talked about seemed a lot less positive. Is this kind of the direction that he's going in foreign policy? Because the image that I often hear in Washington is, oh, South Korea doesn't want to have to choose between China and America. One's the economic partner, one's a security partner. We're just happy to sit in the middle and kind of have both. Is the ground on that shifting, perhaps?
It's what's the right metaphor? It's not shifting, but there's tremors or something. I mean, that's a very good description of the landscape. The outgoing administration, I would say, the generic sort of default liberal view would emphasize we don't want to choose. We're 100% committed to the alliance with the United States and the relationship with the United States. And the United States is our primary buddy in the world. There's kind of no question about that. But we have this huge economic relationship with China. And also, we don't want to get in rivalry mode with China. We want to keep minimizing, sure, confront where we have to, but we want to minimize that. And we want to keep expanding cooperation, which probably you guys would agree is not the way it's being talked about in the United States or in Washington, right? And so in that sense, there has been a gap. It's jury's out. I mean, this will be one of it's good to flag it. This will be one of the big questions is how the signaling in the campaign mode was, we want to signal to the US we are 100% on board. And by implication, that means you're going to have a rougher relationship with China. But what's the follow through on that? How does that take concrete material form? I mean, I noted, I think it was the day after his election, the president-elect met with the Chinese ambassador to South Korea. And it wasn't a dress down. This was not Anchorage, for those of you who follow US-China talks. This was like friendlier than Rome, the more recent, it was quite friendly and talking about mutual cooperation. So that was an interesting signal. If you're really about big change, like no more Mr. Nice Guy with China, sign us up for the Quad and the Indo-Pacific, then I'm not sure that's a signal you would send. But look, these are going to be a lot of decisions, daily decisions, weekly, monthly decisions for the new administration. And they're going to probably lose a lot of control. Events are going to move and they're going to have to react and decide. So it's honestly, it's very hard. I'm trying not to prejudge how they do it, because both in terms of just basic economic self-interest for South Korea, with that huge economic interdependence with China and knowing China will use the economic levers as they did with THAAD, that's a lot of counter pressure to say we want to minimize, kind of fallout in the China relationship. That any president, whether they're liberal or conservative, they have to deal with that. And then the public's mixed. I mean, again, 70% of at least on polls of Koreans are negative toward China. And actually, I would say that is much more real to me, anecdotally, for whatever that's worth, than the nuclear stuff. Like, there's definitely been a steady trend of negativity, and I can give you the laundry list, general negativity toward China in the time I've been here since 2010. Much clearer to me than like we want nukes, South Koreans. But how does that manifest in real policy? Because also South Koreans do not want to see, do not want to absorb big economic costs in a diplomatic fallout, And the last thing I'd say is, again, to the question of part of this is what difference does it make to have a liberal versus a conservative administration? The last conservative, Park Geun-hye, who was impeached, who President-elect Yoon just met with in a little bit of a, to me, surprising, very public celebration of their closeness. She's the one, for those of you who remember, she visited Tiananmen Square September 2015 for Xi Jinping's big anti-Japan rally, celebrating victory over Japan in 1945. There's these incredible pictures of, Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin, and Park Geun-hye. The Conservative Party leader, so it was actually under conservatives that the South Korea-China relationship reached its peak and then collapsed. So it's a much more complicated situation, I would say. And I myself do not know where this administration really wants to take it and how things are going to play out. And again, I'm not sure how much they're going to be in control. But that's the best I could say to try and kind of lay the land for how it could evolve.
Well, and I've definitely been seeing a similar trend in public attitudes here in Washington over the last 10 years or so, regarding China. It's become much more negative, much more wary. But let's talk about the relationship with North Korea for a bit. Is this kind of an end for the era of diplomacy that Moon Jae-in seemed to be pursuing?
Yeah, I mean, that ended in Hanoi when the Trump-Kim negotiation went south. That was February 2019. That really was actually the end of this incredible window. Now, for those who don't know, I'm a peacenik, pro-engagement guy. And so for someone from my perspective, it was extraordinary how the door opened, and the possibilities and things were really happening over the course of 2018. And that was directly in line, with what the Moon administration did want to do. And they were just doing everything that they could to sandbag it, to move on to the next thing. And some are very critical of Moon. I think history will be kind to him. I think he did extraordinary work in terms of trying to keep things aligned to tee up the Trump administration. And frankly, to do some of the groundwork that there were good people working under Trump, but there was so much chaos at the top. Moon Jae-in was helping to be more kind of a steady. There were a lot of negotiations between North and South Korea, and some of that was teeing up where the Trump-Kim negotiations could go next. So but again, that whole process lasted from kind of January 1, 2018 to February, whatever it was, 2019, when Hanoi, fell apart. And so in that sense, it's already been 3 years that Moon, in his second half of the term, 5-year terms, Moon was trying to resuscitate. Then COVID kind of killed off everything. And so it's not like there's this active diplomatic initiative. There is a framework there. There are agreements that were made in 2018 that that the new administration could signal we want to reactivate those, but they haven't sent any of those signals, or just kind of the weakest, open to dialogue. I mean, frankly, a little bit like the Biden administration. Oh, open to dialogue. What's wrong with the North Koreans? They won't talk to us. We could see that early on, but there's not. Again, conservatives have their own history of actually talking to North Koreans and doing serious negotiation with North Korea. So it's not like only liberals talk to North Korea, but the previous two administrations, Park Geun-hye and her conservative predecessor, Lee Myung-bak had almost nothing. Park Geun-hye had just a little bit, although she sent very strong signals she wanted to talk, but then nothing really materialized. So my anticipation is there's not going to be dialogue. There's none now. I don't see it reviving this year. I see this being a pretty turbulent year in terms of, cascading escalatory cycles. And maybe when you get into, this administration has 5 years. It's a long time. I wouldn't be surprised in a year, 2 or 3, if there are some kind of resumption of negotiations, but it gets harder and harder to anticipate what's the framework for that. What are the goals? A lot will have changed between now and then.
Well, we've got a question from our audience here related to this from In10. It's asking about North Korean revisionism. Is that a thing? Are they a revisionist power? Do they really want to shake things up? Or are they really just kind of focused on survival, getting to next year?
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm trying, because in the kind of there's less use of the term revisionist power, or I guess I see it less in the discussion around North Korea than, say, with China. I know immediately what that means. I'm trying to think, what does that mean in a North Korean context to be a revisionist power? But when you, John, frame it versus survival, I guess in what state doesn't seek its own survival, right? So the base for everyone is survival. We are all defensive realists in that sense. It's certainly including North Korea, not just regime survival, but national security, national survival. So many of the actions that they take are actually in accordance with that generic logic of survival and national security terms, including a lot of what they do with their nuclear program. In terms of being revisionist, like more ambitious than survival, I've always argued, and I continue to believe, that Kim Jong-un, in part because of he's younger, he's between probably some of your guys' age and my age. I guess I'm not young anymore, but I see him as a very ambitious political figure in that sense, unlike his, and he also took office younger than his father. So I do see him as an ambitious figure. I don't think survival encapsulates Kim Jong-un, although in my view, his real, in national security terms, he's mostly about survival. I don't think he's a revisionist, like territorially. I do not think he wants South Korea. And we can have a separate Zoom on why, but I've been to North Korea, and my big insight from 4 trips, it's been a while, to North Korea, and seeing their system and observing it from afar, is the last thing you would want if you're North Korea is South Korea. That's like a North Korean nightmare, because North Korea is all predicated on control and uniformity as much as possible. And they know enough about South Korea to know this place is not predicated on control and uniformity. And so while they signal they want it, I don't think they really want it. I don't think he really wants it. I think his big ambition is actually economic, and that's also so far mostly his failure, although there was some initial success. So in my view, Kim Jong-un, when he thinks beyond survival, I think it's in those terms of, catching North Korea up with the region. And so, yeah, that's where I see the ambitions. And we saw some of that come out in 2018. And then it sort of fell apart as a casualty of the diplomatic unraveling. And then he basically let it go for a while. So one of the questions for me is, will he go back to that economic ambition?
Yeah, well, you mentioned how young he is, and that brings up a related question, which is, how does a guy, this young, who came on, you could say inexperienced, surrounded by a lot of people who had operated and survived in the system for decades, how does he hold on to power? And how stable is his rule? Are we going to see, Kim Jong-un being the leader of North Korea for the rest of his natural life? Or is this a guy who really has to watch his back?
Well, I wanted to say, where's my Riverside Shakespeare? Because we got a lot of political scientists like data. I'm a historian, so we don't really talk about data, but we have a lot of data on young leaders. And actually, Kim Jong-un is not young by the standards of the kind of system that he's in, which we have a strange inability to digest this and kind of analyze it properly, I feel. We classify North Korea as communist, which it is, or totalitarian, which it aspires to be. Autocracy is the big term du jour now. It's all those things. It's authoritarian, but it's also dynastic. And there have been a lot of dynastic systems throughout world history in this part of the region and elsewhere. And we know a lot about structural features of dynastic rule. So one of those things is he was not that young, even though I realize I just said it, John. He's young by kind of our standards. He's not young by dynastic standards. Young by dynastic standards is 6. And, 20 is old or average. Maybe 30 would be old. 20 is average. So again, in terms of then also your other questions, what are the threats he faces? Well, again, using what we know from histories of dynastic politics, the first thing you worry about is not a military coup. It's, depending on the times, not a foreign invasion. It's your uncle and your brother. Those are the people you worry about. And what did Kim Jong-un do? He, within a couple of years, had his uncle arrested and executed, and had his elder half-brother assassinated. So it was almost, this is horrible to say, but almost like textbook Shakespearean dynastic politics and consolidation of rule. And so he sort of ticked a lot of those boxes. He also, for years, he and those who he really trusts around him, which include his sister, not unusual, they have rearranged the chairs. They have demoted, not always purged. It's not like always assassinating people. It's also just retiring people off, promoting new people in the party, military, and government hierarchies. So 10 years in, a lot of work has been done to consolidate his rule. And to me, he looks quite secure. Of course, I have to add the caveat that we definitely have limited, insight into North Korea. So I could be very wrong. But from what I can see, it looks secure. And the primary threat to him looks like his physical health, his personal health. But still, he's young in kind of medical terms. And I operate on the assumption that, 30 more years of Kim Jong-un seems like sort of a safe operating assumption, though who of us know how long any of us has. But yeah, I think that it's important to at least consider a 30-year timeline, as you're kind of thinking through this issue. And the other factor is he probably works off of a 30-year timeline, whether he makes it there or not. And we know that affects decision-making, right? Like Joe Biden has a midterm and re-election timeline. Xi Jinping has a next party Congress and then 5, 10-year, whatever he has timeline, right? Every political system has timelines. Kim Jong-un is a bit unique in that he's got a dynastic timeline, and by modern standards, he is relatively young. And so he probably has a 30-year timeline. So yeah, I think that's important to keep in mind.
Well, we've got a lot of time to get to know him. My colleague Julie sent me a question about the discourse in Washington and how this lands to you. We'll hear a lot of folks talking about China as having a lot of ability to put pressure on North Korea, a lot of ability to shape North Korean behavior if it wanted to. That, if we were to get China somehow to put pressure on North Korea, that this would change the dynamics in a negotiation. Do you think this image is true, is workable?
No, I think it's a bit. I think American diplomats and strategists waste time thinking about that play. Get China to pressure North Korea, and that will force North Korea in a direction we want. I see a number of places where like the pool balls don't move in the way that you want them to move. For one thing, China uses that a lot to kind of eat up the agenda and keep America begging for help on North Korea. And in the kind of all the bartering that's constantly going on in terms of agenda items for the US and China, it's quite useful to, from a Chinese perspective, to have that hope, keep that hope alive, but never actually do it, because then it loses its utility. So that's the first place where I think you're stuck, like constantly trying to hit the ball and it never actually moves. But then if you ever hit the ball and China does put that pressure on North Korea will defy Chinese coercion and let the relationship get worse and basically use its asymmetric, it has its pressure points with China. And just like it's able to defy the United States and doesn't heed what we say, even when you've got a madman president who seems like he's really getting to the point of like maybe actually bring this to war, bloody nose, all that 2017 stuff. North Koreans are like, bring it on, right? Now they're bluffing to some extent, but only to some extent. They've got this big advantage over all the rest of us, and this certainly includes China, which is they've got like nothing to lose compared to us, compared to South Korea, compared to the United States and China. It's an impoverished, isolated place where the one big thing they have is their weapons program. And so when they want, they can, turn everything toward China and make China very uncomfortable. And they've shown a willingness to do that. Kim Jong-un has shown a willingness to do that, as his father and grandfather did. It's a long tradition. And the Chinese know that. So there are real limits to how far the Chinese will take this. And then suddenly it becomes, yeah, the Chinese are all about stability. They're worried about instability. This is destabilizing, and so suddenly the pool balls start moving backwards, and you're just back where you started. So I'm very negative, as you can tell, John, on that move. I think if the United States wants to get North Korea to move in the direction we want, first of all, timing matters. It's not always a good time to really try hard. But when you want to try hard, you do it by putting stuff on the table, not saying we're open to talk, saying like, we know you want to talk because we're talking about the stuff you want to talk about, not complete denuclearization, which is obviously what we want to talk about. Let's talk about sanctions relief. Let's talk about the joint exercises and creating a less threatening environment for you. Let's talk about political normalization. Let's talk about all these things we can do. Frankly, the kind of stuff Donald Trump was very credibly putting on the table and talking about. That's why the North Koreans came out. He got them because he was speaking to their agenda. At least he was really meeting them halfway. So that's, if the United States wants to make progress with North Korea, it doesn't go through Beijing. It's directly with Pyongyang. And otherwise it's kind of wasting time.
Well, we're almost out of time here, so maybe this is the last question. Okay. The topic that's on everyone's minds on this side of the planet these days is the war in Ukraine, and it's become a bit of a centerpiece, it seems, of American diplomacy to try to kind of split countries away from Russia. And I'm curious how South Korea in particular, but maybe also North Korea, is navigating this situation. I mean, they've had to navigate this with U.S.-Iran relations before, but how are they handling it with regard to U.S.-Russia relations, putting pressure on them?
Yeah, great question. So I'll try to do both. On North Korea, it's one of the reasons I'm worried about this coming year, because it already kind of looked bad. And then Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the war, and the global ripple effects it's having, that is a recipe for North Korean adventurism, provocation, whatever you want to call it, in that it would not surprise me if Russia, maybe quietly rather than loudly, but signals to the North Koreans, hey, do whatever you want. We got our hands full. Wouldn't be bad if there's trouble over there. And we're certainly not going to, is Russia going to pass any new sanctions this year on North Korea? Is China? They're out there very publicly every day talking about how sanctions don't work and sanctions are adding fuel to the fire. So if you imagine kind of a worst case scenario of North Korean testing a nuclear device, a military reconnaissance satellite, try that big ICBM again, a submarine based launch, if you consider those like the big four, and others can think of more, at what point would China and Russia at the UN Security Council say, okay, yeah, that's too much. Let's put some new sanctions on North Korea? Quite the opposite. I could see, especially Russia, not being very interested in implementing the sanctions that exist. Energy caps on North Korea, that's one of the big sanctions of 2017 that Russia signed onto. In the current and ongoing sort of energy war, is Russia going to strictly implement energy caps against North Korea? So I'm very concerned that it creates an opening again for the situation to get worse. And also, I mean, North Korea might do it anyway. But I suppose what I actually worry the most about is the damage it does to the UNSC, which has held up those sanctions. Actually, I don't think sanctions are that great to begin with in terms of efficacy, but the UNSC has maintained some modicum of credibility in dealing with the North Korea issue. Not success, but just modicum of credibility. And I worry that could fall apart, that it could really kind of break this year in the confluence of the war in Ukraine, the response, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the response by NATO, by the US, by Europe, with stuff happening over here. So as far as South Korea is concerned, probably you've seen some of the coverage. The reaction has been different here. I would say tepid. Although, when I was in Europe recently, in Sweden, and also talking to Europeans here, actually, the view is that South Korea is not a spoiler. They've kind of kept up, with the international, whether it's US led or Europe led. I mean, a lot of this is Europe, as an equal member of trying to rally the world and rally friends in Asia. My sense of the general view is South Korea has kept up. South Korea is not like a laggard, but Japan is clearly way out ahead of the pack. And then in terms of sort of public responses, I mean, to me, it was quite dispiriting to see there was hardly a turnout when the Ukrainian president spoke recently virtually to the South Korean National Assembly. And so you see kind of indicators like that. That there's not a strong feeling in South Korea, but that's a hard one. My own experience, again, is very mixed, and it's not like totally cold, but there is a self-interested, we got a lot to handle in our own neighborhood. Russia is not seen as a threat to South Korea. Russia does not meddle in South Korean elections. Russia does not threaten South Korea territorially or otherwise. Russia, you have to understand, has been in a neighborhood of like not getting along with anyone, basically, which is South Korea's predicament, and having no one else. There's no EU, there's no NATO out here. Russia's been like the kind of neutral, like easier to get along with. And so it has been difficult, not natural for South Korea to say, yeah, great, we're on board with this stuff. So I don't know where it heads next. This is one thing I was referencing earlier in terms of events being beyond South Korea's control. And then this will obviously be a huge challenge for the incoming administration. How do they navigate this? And they're not at the table. They aren't at the G7. They're not in the Quad, where even India is obviously taking a totally different approach. Right? Not even, abstaining from the vote. South Korea has voted with Europe and the US and everyone else at the UN level, India abstaining. But India can hear the criticism, but also make its arguments in the Quad meetings, for example, at a summit level. South Korea doesn't have that seat at the table. Japan has its membership at G7 where important decisions have been made. So it gets credit for being proactive, and it's also part of the process. South Korea is not there. Right. So again, there's this dilemma for South Korean strategy and diplomacy where this stuff affects you. It's not insignificant, but you're not like at the table in the same way. And so that will be a major challenge for the Yoon administration, maybe not only this year, but for some years to come, depending on how all this plays out.
Thank you very much for all of your time, Dr. Delury. We've been speaking with Dr. John Delury of Yonsei University. I've dropped a link in the chat for some upcoming events, but we will see everybody soon. Have a great evening.